Introduce myself to this camera. So, hello everyone. I am Megan, and I'll say hello to your camera as well. I'm Megan. I'm the founder of Leek Loves You, which is a group to promote love and peace in Leek. We're not an anti-Christian group. I want to make that very clear. We very much respect Christianity. We just want to have some questions about your street preaching and how you approach it.
Great.
And Jonathan's very kindly taken some time out of his busy day to come and answer some of my questions, as well as some of the questions off the group, which I've sort of concised down. Okay, anything you want to say?
Not really. Very happy to be here. Always happy to try and answer questions, particularly when they're posed in a constructive way. So, over to you, Meg.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one we had was, this was for myself. What news outlets do you tend to use for your information? So I know we had a conversation while you were preaching about decriminalising abortion law. How many different outlets do you look into before you preach? What do you research first?
Because of the nature of preaching, it tends to be quite spontaneous.
Yeah.
So at times I've researched things in advance. At times I'm drawing on stuff that I've read previously. And when I do that, that can be dangerous territory.
Yeah.
Because things aren't always firm and established in my mind.
Sorry.
In regards to your illustration, I mean, regarding that, I'd read that from multiple news outlets. I'd read it on the government website.
Yeah.
So when a bill is being placed before Parliament, they will publish the full bill. So in that example, there were actually two bills that were being voted on. The stronger of the two bills didn't make the cut. The weaker of the two bills did.
What were the two bills? Because I'm not as up to date on it as I'd like
So
to
it's
be.
basically on decriminalising abortion.
Yeah, I've read that. So that was the one that did pass. What was the stronger one?
So the stronger one would have basically allowed medical professionals to be part of that process.
Okay.
Up until birth.
And would that be if it was a medical reason or just any reason?
I was referring to the weaker one, the one that was actually passed.
Yeah.
So
you've not
as far as I recall, the more stronger one would have allowed abortion until birth for any reason at all, with medical assistance.
Would you have preferred that one to pass?
Oh, absolutely not.
So
would you have preferred?
I see.
Yeah.
Personally, I am pro-choice. You know, I don't agree with it as a form of contraception. I don't think it should be used irresponsibly. But there are always circumstances where I believe, it's needed. There's always medical reasons. I've been through 2 very tough pregnancies myself. I couldn't do it personally, but I will not hold any judgment on those who do, because we're not them. We'll never know their reasonings, and until we're in someone's mind, we can't.
So the weaker bill, and the point I was raising on the street was it's basically decriminalised abortion up until birth. It doesn't mean that you can go to a doctor at any point for any reason and have an abortion. But if a woman chooses to use medication or use some other means to kill her unborn child, there will be no ramifications for that.
Okay, thank you. My phone's locked again. Do you have any preaching qualifications? I know there's theology schools to become a priest or a pastor. Do you have any yourself?
So the Christian position, the biblical position, is it's not about going to a seminary and gaining a qualification, as it were, but we are qualified when God calls us.
Okay.
So I believe that God has called me to preach the gospel, and as part of that calling, I will then study to do the best at that as I can. So I've not been to a seminary. I've read a lot. I've listened to a lot. I've watched hundreds of hours of podcasts and sermons and lectures. While I was in Pakistan, there was a Reformed Baptist seminary, and they put all their seminary syllabus online for free. So I was able to access a lot of their modules.
It's good that it's free. Yes, and for anyone who hasn't seen Jonathan preach, you can ask him at any point in the Bible and you will be able to find it, won't you? You're very good at that. So, are there things that you think shouldn't be talked about at street preaching? As it is in public, there will be vulnerable and children about, and they don't really have an option to not hear it if they are walking past.
Sure, particularly subjects around sex. I think that children's innocence should be preserved as long as possible, so certainly.
But you have spoken about sex in preaching before, so at what point's the line drawn?
So I'll refer to sex without going into the graphic details of it, and I think particularly in our culture, children are generally exposed to at least a degree of sexual thought, sexual language from quite a young age via media, playground talk, just culture as a whole. So I don't have any problems with using the word sex.
Yep.
But if we're talking about the mechanics of that, one-to-one, and on the street, the other day I referred specifically to anal sex. I didn't describe what that was or go into any more detail than that. But to deal with the point that was actually being talked about, I was specific there. But I certainly wouldn't make a habit of doing that.
Mm-hmm. What denomination of Christianity do you follow, and where is it that you're currently going to church?
Slightly complicated. Like you, grew up, or certainly spent a large part of my life going to an Assemblies of God Pentecostal church. Mm-hmm. As I've grown, I guess my theology has kind of evolved a bit. Mm-hmm. And so I hold certain biblical positions that wouldn't be consistent with a lot of Pentecostal doctrine, still embrace a lot of that. I'm currently fellowshipping in a church in Hanley called The Presence, which is a charismatic church.
And what does, for those who don't know, what is a charismatic church?
So a Pentecostal or charismatic church basically believes that there is a continuation of certain spiritual gifts. Okay. Things like prophecy, where we can hear the Spirit of God directly, and other such things.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, this one was from one of the followers. Okay. It's a heavy one, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
If we could know for certain that a child would be born gay, would you support abortion?
Absolutely not.
So even if they were gay?
Categorically not. Right. I deplore the killing of children, be them in the womb, out of the womb.
Even if there was absolutely no chance that they would ever be a straight
person?
Okay,
sure.
Thank you. So obviously you post everything on Facebook. A lot of your followers, it ends up in a lot of arguing in the comments, doesn't it? Sometimes those comments can be quite insulting. Mm-hmm. Do you disagree with those insults? Because, do you feel that's a good way that they are spreading God's word?
I mean, this is quite a new trend.
Yes.
When I was in Pakistan, I didn't use Facebook for Muslims because of the content I was posting. So I would have Muslim friends on WhatsApp, and my Facebook friends were largely Christians, and I post the content I do primarily to encourage, to provoke the church to action, to generate prayer. Partly due to your involvement, and just certain videos becoming somewhat viral, certainly in the Leek groups. Yeah. That has attracted people who are not Christians to my page.
I mean the Christians, because a couple of them can be quite insulting of other people. Sure.
I welcome comments from everybody.
Yep.
The only comments I do delete are comments that are like clearly blasphemous, pictures of Jesus. Yep. Aside from that, I let everything go, and unbelievers from Leek, people who would not be in my camp, as it were, there's a lot of insults, there's a lot of slander that comes from them. I've been accused of being a paedophile. I've been spoken of in very derogatory ways, and there are people who really don't seem to want to reason. They ask a question, they get a response, and they just respond with insults. Yeah. From what I've observed of Christians, and there have been a few moments where I've intervened and said, let's kind of keep this civil.
I appreciated you doing that.
But largely speaking, I'm not unduly concerned with the comments that are coming from Christians. I might choose to respond slightly differently, but I've not seen anything that I would class as offensive.
Okay. So you vocalise that you think Trinity Church, which is Methodist, and the Salvation Army are incorrect. What makes your sect of Christianity right and theirs wrong?
Good question. I don't know exactly where the Salvation Army stand. It was my understanding that although they are somewhat inclusive, doctrinally in their beliefs, they still believe homosexuality is a sin. So I was quite surprised to see them as one of the official sponsors for Stoke Pride. Whether that is true or whether Stoke Pride have got their facts wrong, I don't know. In regards to Trinity and the Methodist Church, there are some Methodist churches that break the mold and they stick to traditional values, but generally speaking, the Methodist Church as a whole voted on homosexuality, on allowing homosexuals to get married in churches and so forth. And that represents to me a departure from the scripture. So as a Christian, if you could sit down with the Bible with me and show me an error in my belief, I would be very open to having my beliefs changed. Okay. But when I look at a church like Trinity, they have departed from the plain teaching of Scripture.
Okay. So this isn't on the question, but it's just made me think. So I'm not straight. However, I am in a straight. Sorry, knocking the microphone. I'm in a straight presenting relationship. I am with a man.
Sure.
I'm a cis woman. Would I be allowed to get married in the church to him, even though I also find women, non-binary, trans people attractive?
In Trinity, possibly, probably.
But not in another.
Should you be allowed to get married in a church? No.
Okay.
And the reason for that is I believe that marriage is a very specific institution ordained by God, and it is between a man and a woman for life.
What about, just to add on to that, so say I was straight completely, I already have 2 children outside of marriage. Would you be comfortable with a straight couple with children to get married in a church?
I mean, if I was pastoring a church, I don't really believe it's the church's remit to, in terms of funerals, in terms of marriage. If I was pastoring a church, I would be marrying or leading funerals for people who were Christians or had Christian family. But I wouldn't have a problem with a straight couple with children who had obviously lived in what the Bible would describe as sin, but now the desire to get married. I believe that is good, to at least come to that place of forming a covenant, making promises, exchanging vows. I think that is good for the couple.
So I believe it's in the Bible, it says, once you've laid the man or a woman, you are married in the eyes of God.
Kind of, there's that spiritual joining. The Bible says that the man and his wife, they become one flesh. And so that is why Christians traditionally have had very strong views of divorce and remarriage, sleeping around, suggesting that a man can marry a man or a woman can marry a woman, because of how the Bible describes the institution of marriage.
Okay. Fab. You mentioned as well funerals. So I take it you wouldn't want to, you don't believe that homosexual people should have a funeral in a church. They should go to the crematorium, or...
It's not that I don't believe that they should have a funeral, but I believe, largely speaking, the church is for the people of God. So if the church is administrating kind of civic events like marriage, funerals, I would expect that to be for members of their congregation, people who have some links to the church. If somebody asked me to conduct a funeral for somebody who'd lived as a homosexual, I would happily do that, but my aim would be to preach the gospel in that funeral to their relatives, and that could possibly create offence.
Probably. So what about burial grounds? Because they tend to be by the church. Are you okay with anyone being buried in a burial ground? There's just murderers and all that as well that have to be buried somewhere.
I suppose it depends on the church and what the burial ground is for. I mean, largely speaking, most burials are probably outside of churches, more in council, civil property. I don't really. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, once a person is dead, the body is immaterial. It doesn't concern me where a man, regardless of how he's lived, is buried. I'm concerned about his soul.
Okay. So, are you aware that your preaching has had a negative impact on local businesses? How do you feel about that? Does it concern you?
I would kind of ask for the evidence of that.
I do have evidence.
Okay.
So I've had quite a lot of businesses when I've asked what questions. So a couple of them have said, they have noticed since you have been preaching on Wednesdays, their sales are now down. And
so we are
people as well saying,
I think any business on a high street needs to expect and have a degree of flexibility for all kinds of things that are going to happen, be that buskers, protests, parades, preaching. There's been a long history of preaching in this town. When I was young, church groups used to go out and have open-air meetings.
I remember.
I've been preaching in the town before I ever went to Pakistan for many, many years now. There was a Scottish preacher who would regularly come into Leek. I believe it was aggro with market stall holders that eventually led him to shaking the dust off his feet, as it were, and saying, "Luke, I'm going to go somewhere else." But I do try to be sensitive to local businesses. So I wasn't party to the voluntary agreement regarding time limits in places. So I'm not binding myself to that. But when that was introduced, the intent was that the preaching would only take place in one location for up to, I think it was 20 minutes.
20 minutes,
And then the preaching would move. But as soon as that happened, there were comments from business owners saying it was making things worse.
Okay.
Because rather than it being centralised, suddenly the whole town is affected by it.
But if it's centralised, it's specific businesses that are always affected.
So my style is slightly different in that I like interaction. I encourage it.
Yeah.
And so I may preach for 15 or 20 minutes, and depending on how that goes, that might lead to like a half an hour encounter with an individual or a group of people after that. And when I come on a Wednesday, I tend to be here for a good amount of time, late morning till sort of mid-afternoon.
Yeah.
And I'm not preaching continually. I'll maybe preach for half an hour, have a pause for an hour and a half, engage with people one-to-one. 2 Wednesdays ago, I was conscious that I'd been in one spot for quite a while, outside the Cock Inn, my favourite spot. There was a busker who had actually come into the area. I was there first, but I thought I would give some ground to him. And so I packed up and I moved to the market square. And I'd only been there for 1 minute. I'd literally been preaching for less than 1 minute, and I had a market stall holder turn over my table, raise a walking stick to me, made it very, very obvious that he didn't want me there, had a lady from a shop come to me very concerned about her business, reckons that her sales are down 50% whenever I'm out. And yet, Megan, I very, very rarely preach near the market square. I think I've only preached there once or twice before for a very short duration. On that occasion, I'd been there for a minute. And so I would be very surprised that 20 minutes of preaching or 15 minutes of preaching would lead to a 50% decrease in sales. And how are we evaluating that? I mean, if we're going to come up with statistics, we need kind of a forecast, not a forecast, we need a measure over a long period of time because there's all kinds of variables. So I'm kind of questioning the degree of effect on local businesses, and we do try to take that into account.
So from the understanding of how I view it and as other people have viewed it is, and including comments online, so obviously a lot of these businesses have been here for years, so they can look at years and see what they have made that week, years in the past. So in that case, they do have their proof there. But the thing that happens is it doesn't matter where you have set up. There are many people who are just completely avoiding town because they don't want to hear it. They're feeling that it's not safe for their children to come, and that's not me saying that. That's things I have read online from people's comments. So I believe that that's where the reduction in business is not necessarily where you set up. So it doesn't matter if you've been on the marketplace a minute, people know you're there, they avoid it.
Yeah. I mean, that's something really outside of my remit. If people are so offended or so upset by preaching, biblical preaching in the street, and they don't have the maturity, the courage to simply walk by and do their shopping. And like I said to you the other day, I'm not tying people up, I'm not cutting off their legs, I'm not preventing them entering into shops.
I have seen you reach out and try and engage people though. Maybe they don't want that?
Not in the sense of grabbing them. I mean, usually my manner on the street is to simply say, "Excuse me, sir, madam, do you have a moment?" If they say no, I'll say, "Can I give you something to read then?" So again, if that is so intrusive to somebody that they feel unable to do their shopping or bring their children into town, then that leads me to be concerned about sections of society. Now, I've had parents bring their young children to my table because their children have been in the vicinity, attracted by what's being preached. So this is by no means the reaction of everybody.
No. Okay. So, as I say, spoken a lot about abortion. Just a very quick one before I go into the next section of the question. Morning after pill. Is that a class as an abortive method to you? Do you disagree?
I don't think I've ever mentioned the morning after pill during my preaching.
Okay.
Where's that?
I think it might have been on Facebook. This is from one of the members who've asked this question.
Okay.
I think you mentioned it on Facebook. So they just wanted to know if you class that as an abortive method.
Okay. So the only thing I would have said in regards to the morning after pill, Plan B, would be that when we talk of abortion statistics, so 250,000 babies are killed in this nation, unborn children in this nation every year on average. That doesn't include the morning after pill. It doesn't include
Right.
abortive forms of contraception. I have concerns about the morning after pill. As I understand it, the primary function of the morning after pill is to prevent conception.
Mm. Yeah,
You're
that's what I was
smiling.
going to say. Is
Yeah.
my next question was, do you
Okay.
understand how it works?
I think so, largely. I mean, my understanding of the, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the morning after pill, it effectively prevents ovulation.
Yes.
So it holds back the egg from being released.
It delays it.
Sure.
So you'll still, if you take the morning
Mhm.
after pill, you can still, say it delays your ovulation by a week. You
Mhm.
can still then get pregnant a week later.
Sure. So it's
not
suppressing
abortive,
that. It's holding.
just-
Yeah. Sure. So it holds the, or it tries to hold the egg back from being released.
Yeah.
It also, as I understand it, I think it thickens the cervical mucus as well. So if the egg is already, if the first option's failed,
Yep.
and the egg makes its way into wherever the egg needs to be, if there are sperm present, the mucus will be thickened to act as a barrier to that sperm getting through the egg. Okay, so none of that is abortive. That is preventative,
Okay.
and I have no issue with that.
Yeah.
And the concern is, and I think that it was certainly on some of the packaging for the medication, at least at one point.
Mm-hmm.
The concern is, and this is where we're in somewhat of a grey area, whether the medication itself also changes the nature of the uterine lining.
Yeah.
So it actually, once that egg, if it was fertilized, it actually prevents it implanting.
It does not. I have many friends who have had children after taking the morning after pill. So.
No, but in certain circumstances, at least this was a concern put out there by the drug manufacturers. They gave that disclaimer that although this isn't the design of what we're selling, this can be a consequence. Now, I believe as science has looked into that, and there's been medical advances and things, that position is ordered.
Yep.
But there are concerns, so it's somewhat of a grey area.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So, right. So this is a long question. However, I'm going to read it. So,
Okay.
you've told me that you actively encourage your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who protest and preach outside abortion centres that you support them. You know, you actively encourage them.
Sure.
How do you feel about the people who are going to those centres that don't want to? So they could have lost a baby late term and are devastated.
Mhm.
Children who've been assaulted, those that have been medically told they cannot have their baby and they desperately want it. Do you not have concerns that those preachers are adding to those people's anguish? Because that's the majority of people going to abortion centres.
I mean, in the
these
UK
days.
now, a lot of our abortion centres are simply inaccessible now because of abortion buffer zones that have been placed around the vicinity of those.
Mhm.
In regards to, I can't speak for every Christian or every protester. In regards to my friends that go to such places in the UK, in America, and elsewhere, they go there to seek to bring assistance to these people. They will go with information packs. They will go with practical help. They will go with a message of hope. They will go pointing to people to alternatives. So if a woman is planning an abortion, there are alternatives. There is adoption.
But what about those who literally the baby's already dead inside them, it's rotting, it's killing them, or they would literally die, both of them, if that baby is born? How do you know the difference? How do you know which ones are acceptable to approach? You know, those that are just going and using it as a contraception, and those who are already, you know, on the verge of exiting the world themselves.
I mean, if
to
somebody's
solve that.
going to a centre like that because their child is already deceased and they just need to deal with the medical ramifications of that, then I can't imagine why they would be concerned about the preaching of the gospel in regards to protecting unborn life. They're not culpable. Their baby is already deceased. They've not been involved in that
I
process.
think a lot of women, and that's speaking from a woman myself who's had a miscarriage, blame themselves. And to hear someone saying, you know, there's other options, or, you know, God doesn't want babies to be killed,
Sure.
that would have sent me over the edge personally.
Okay.
And I imagine I've seen women who've gone into even worse states over losing children.
Mhm.
So that's my concern.
I mean, I don't know how things work. I don't know if people who've already lost their child would actually be going to an abortion centre.
Because many of the centres are actually not just abortion centres,
Mhm.
they are where you can go and get contraception, you get sexual health testing
Okay.
advice, it's not just abortion.
Okay. Well, I would hope that there would be sensitivity to such people.
Yeah.
But then what about the majority of people who are going to those centres to kill their children?
Is that the majority of people going to those centres to do that?
we would need to look at the statistics of it, but even if there was a minority of people, surely it's worth it if one mother changes her mind and doesn't kill her child. And there are many stories of women who are so grateful down the line that they have been intercepted, they've heard a message, they've received literature, they've rethought their position. Sometimes just being shown an image of what their child potentially looks like at that stage of development can be a powerful thing to change a woman's mind, a mother's mind. So I would rather the sentiments, the feelings of a few vulnerable people were potentially hurt if unborn lives were saved in that process. And also, anybody who's going to those places, at least my Christian friends, they're not going there just to condemn abortion or speak into abortion. They're going to preach the gospel of hope in Christ. And so if a woman has lost her child, that there is a hope.
Okay. So just to go back to what you said at the beginning there, to get my understanding correct, in the hopes that it would save, say, one unborn child, it is okay that it's possibly causing anguish to hundreds of women. That's what I'm getting from that the small minority is who you're aiming at, and then the others, they're just kind of collateral damage.
I don't want to speak into an area where I don't have statistics to sway my opinion either way, but I would really question the premise that most people who go to abortion centres are going distraught because they've already lost their children, and out of those women, the majority of those would be in deep anguish because a preacher is there preaching a biblical message about the sanctity of life and offering hope and the gospel.
I think we'll agree to disagree there because, you know, as a woman who's been pregnant 3 times, those hormones do not necessarily make you see things logically that way. Anyway, okay. Just a quick one. What age do you believe is acceptable to bring your children along to street preaching?
I think as soon as they're born.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you worry how the arguments and the language and adverse behaviour during your preaching could affect your children?
I'm conscious of it, but not unduly so. I believe it's... So when I raise children, I raise soldiers.
Okay.
And for the sake of you and your followers, I'm not talking about children that take up machine guns or swords. I'm talking about spiritually. The Bible describes children as being like arrows in the sheath of a man. And so I want to train my children to interact with the world around them in a biblical way, to have foundations for their belief. And so I believe it's good for children to be exposed to other positions and how those positions are dealt with from a biblical perspective. Now, in regards to abuse...
because that can cause trauma. Long life is children witnessing abuse, and then especially if it's their father or their grandparents.
I mean, as a child, I was taken knocking on doors, going door to door, and you'd face a lot of rejection, you would face some hostility. I remember an older man threatening to set his dogs on us, and I took that very seriously as a child. But that was my training ground, to listen to how people in the church dealt with questions, used the Bible, and that was greatly beneficial to me. And if we're talking about what is harmful for a child, I believe it's abundantly more beneficial for a child to be around living Christians affirming a biblical position in love than to be exposed to, for example, what was children were exposed to at Pride yesterday. What
do you think children were exposed to? Because you've said that you were far away, so what was it they were exposed to?
So we were set up outside of the vicinity of the main proceedings. I came through on several occasions just to see what was happening, record some footage. But I only caught about 5 minutes of the end of one of the shows here. There were several men, presumably in drag, at the stage when I came in, they were referring to the little people.
Okay.
And all of the attention was
children.
on...
So I wasn't at the fashion show.
I don't know why the language was little people rather than children, but...
I think it's quite cute.
Okay, they were referring to the little people, and they were sat on the ground at the front.
Yeah.
And as part of that, they were told that they were stars, made up of stars.
Which scientifically we are, yeah.
And they were told that it was up to them to teach their parents culture. What was the other thing? Culture is like a set of 3 things. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I don't want to misquote.
No,
I think one of the things was culture. And I'm thinking, these are little tots. It's not their place to be teaching their parents culture. Like it's up for adults, for parents, for their peers to be teaching them things. So the idea that little children are there to teach their parents a lesson, and then parents were kind of ridiculed because it was like parents teach you maybe morality or ethics or being polite, these kinds of things, but they even struggle with pronouns. And me there as a Christian, I'm thinking, what are we teaching our children?
I think looking at it personally, let's say for example my great-grandparents were racist because that's how they were brought up, and each generation that comes up we must hold accountable the new and progressive ways that the world has gone. So my grandparents would say to me, we don't say the N-word anymore, and my parents to my grandparents, and because that's what's normalised. And so I think in that way it is important that kids teach, and I personally have learned a lot from my children, and they're only 3 and 10 months old, how to look at the world through childlike eyes, and I think that's more what they were trying to say.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, when you've got, they look very young, a lot of the children, when you've got children from perhaps the age of 2 to 6, 7, and they're seeing men dressed up as women in a way that most women wouldn't flaunt themselves in such a way, dancing in quite a provocative way, and dressing in a quite a revealing way. I mean, straight away that concerns me. And then to hear what the children are being indoctrinated with. Now, if you believe that that's true and that's good, by all means. But then some would look at me and say, well, you're brainwashing your children, you're indoctrinating them. And I hold my hands up to that. But I believe I'm indoctrinating them with what is true and what is pure and what is good and beautiful. I look at what was on display yesterday. I saw the main congregation here, the parade here, and it all looked fun. It all looked colourful. People were dressed up elaborately, face paint.
The majority of the people in that parade were straight as well.
It looked totally benign and harmless. And when I came into the market square and I saw how these men were conducting themselves with children, that greatly concerned me.
So 2 points before you talk, if that's all right. Firstly, when you say about revealing, I mean, a man can walk down the street in a speedo or go on the beach, and that's probably wearing less than what a drag queen wears. So, I mean, it's no different in my opinion. However, drag queens have been around for the longest time. All of Shakespeare's plays were men dressed as the women, because obviously women couldn't be in it. And you go to pantomimes, there's always a dame. How is that fashion show any different? It was a performance piece. It wasn't. They don't dress like that every day. You look at RuPaul, for example, one of the most famous drag queens. He's very rarely actually in drag. He's himself and wearing a suit. So how is it any different?
I think there's a distinct difference between a woman taking on a male part in a costume drama, i.e. Shakespeare.
The other way around, sorry. Men dressed as the women.
Sorry.
It's
yes,
all right.
Yeah.
No, I got confused too.
Not men dressed as women. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Because men were the only ones who were allowed to be.
So there's a slight difference between a man taking on a woman's costume for the sake of a drama, i.e. Shakespeare, to some degree pantomimes, although there's always been an air of kind of like sexual innuendo often there that's aimed at the parents, and I disagree with that. I dislike that.
Most children should.
But there's a big difference between that and men dressing in the way they were. It wasn't speedos. They're dressed up to present themselves as women with either false breasts or implants or whatever that was there, and dancing in a way that they were dancing. That is very, very different, at least in my mind.
'Cause there are many women nowadays who are drag queens as well, who dress like that. Chapel Rowan, excellent musician, she's a drag queen.
And also we weren't inviting these people into our libraries to lead story time or bringing these people in as family entertainment. I mean, drag queens would generally be in bars, certain venues.
Have you watched any of the story times with drag queens?
I mean, if there are positive examples, if that is even possible, I've not seen that.
The majority, they're not in there dancing, they're literally just in there in their makeup, telling the story, and the kids don't see it as, oh, this is someone who's sexualising as a drag queen. They just say, oh, that person's wearing glitter, and they're telling me a story. And they're always stories with positive, affirmations, just like...
kind of endorsing...
No, they're always about, be kind to each other, love yourself, look after people. The ones that I've watched personally are things like The Hare and the Tortoise. Really just good morals.
I think there's also there's certainly been story times that have centred on inclusion, particularly sexual inclusion. And for me, even to have a man dressed up as a woman in that setting, regardless of what she's doing, I believe that that is a corrupting influence upon children. I don't believe that it's something that should be promoted.
Just say that you said regardless of what she's doing.
He's doing.
No,
it all gets so confusing, Meg, does it not?
No, it's just interesting to see how you say that. So, when you're preaching, Old or New Testament?
Both.
Okay.
Primarily new, so the majority is going to be new, but both.
Okay. So, as you're aware, there are some priests, ministers, pastors who disagree with your street preaching. I know you've had interactions with the same Methodist Church.
Sure.
What do you say to them?
Well, I mean, in regards to the vicar who's currently presiding at the Methodist Church, I can't remember her name.
That's the word, thank you.
I mean, she's a heretic. Not just over homosexuality, but she claims that God changes, that God grows, and from any kind of orthodox understanding, that has always been regarded as deeply heretical. It's distorting the very nature of God. So I would have strong disagreements with her on many issues, including homosexuality.
So you say, obviously, God doesn't change, is just okay. But Jesus came in the New Testament to overthrow the teachings of the Old Testament. So surely, it's the very complicated that Jesus, God and the Holy Spirit are technically one, but they're also separate. So if technically God is Jesus and he sent Jesus as his messenger, his son, to overthrow that, surely that's God changing.
Where are you getting that idea from, Meg?
Which idea?
That Jesus came to overthrow the Old Testament.
Because that's what we're taught in church. And many Christians I've spoken to have said that's why we don't abide by, including yourself, that's why we don't abide by the stoning of people who put two crops next to each other anymore. And
no, I mean, you've either been mistaught or you've misunderstood.
Right, I see.
Because that idea contradicts the very teachings of Jesus. He said, I did not come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it.
Right.
He said, you've read the law and the prophets, that symbolizes the Old Testament.
Okay.
He said, these are those that speak of me. And he said, not one jot or one tittle, so that's one little dot or one little line in the law will depart until everything is fulfilled. So Jesus didn't come to take anything away from the law, but whereas mankind, we've all broken God's law in some shape or some form, Christ came to live a perfect life to fulfill the law of his Father.
Okay. In that case, we're going to skip ahead to another question. One of followers, which I believe you've had quite a few interactions with recently, has sent me a list to ask you then. So Jesus didn't overthrow them. So it's gay to be sin to be gay. You do not cut your hair at the sides. You should not be eating seafood. You should not work on the Sabbath. Not eating any animal that doesn't chew the cud or have a cloven hoof. Spreading slander. Not wearing mixed fabrics. Not going to church at a set time after giving birth. The stoning of adulterers, the execution of people who have committed these long list of sins. There's, not planting two crops next to each other, wearing clothes of different cloth. Are all these things that you agree by? Because I'm going to say now, just as we're on camera, you've cut the sides of your hair, you're wearing clothes of different cloth.
Sure.
So.
I have ate shellfish.
Yeah, exactly. I know you're aware.
Don't tell anybody.
You've eaten fish, you've eaten shellfish, you've eaten pork.
Fish are okay, shellfish were forbidden.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, you've sat and called the vicar a heretic, which is technically spreading slander. So
slander is something that is untrue, yeah? It's spreading hearsay, it's spreading something that's not rooted in fact.
Other people may think it's untrue, but we'll not go into that one. So how are you feeling about those rules, and if God and Jesus still want those enacted?
It's going to require a long answer.
Yep, that's fine. This is my big one.
If the intention of this interview is for you and your viewers to... My hope is that you would understand my position.
That's what we're...
And you may still want to crucify me for it or outlaw it for it. But if you at least understand...
Really
sure.
And say, whilst there may be people who insult and, do you want to cause you harm? As I've said to you in private messages, that is never my intention. I'm not here to incite that.
Sure.
I'm here to understand. And
sure.
I do not agree with any form of hatred towards you.
I appreciate
We
that.
just We just want to understand.
I didn't literally think that you were going to time me out there. Some might.
Call
Some
them
might,
off.
So, before I even answer that, I would like to give something of context,
Okay.
particularly in regards to homosexuality and any possible capital punishment for that.
Yes, because that has been the recent topic
Mhm.
of conversation, hasn't it?
So, I want it to be known that I have never, in all of my life, preached, even verbalized that homosexuals should be put to death on any grounds.
But you did say it
Mhm.
would be a step forward for the country if that was implemented.
I was going to come to the until.
Okay.
So this is not my pattern. When I go out to preach, this
Yeah.
doesn't escape my lips.
It's not the starting point,
And
is
to
it?
be quite frank, it's an area of the Bible that I've never really looked at that deeply.
Okay.
So it was only when initially Bill asked me the question on the streets
Mhm.
in response to some exchange that had taken place online, and then you picked up on that, or you chose to ask me of your own according, and you asked me again more precisely.
Yeah. I think there's a lot going on, which is why we've done this today.
And so one of the concerns that you've expressed is by expressing the viewpoint that I've had, that could be seen as inciting violence. Somebody could get the wrong idea of that, or even they could get the right idea and feel that they need to do something. But I want it to be known that this is not something I'm preaching. This is not something I'm volunteering.
The idea of that is that regardless of whether you're preaching it or not, people will take that small soundbite and they will ignore the rest, as I'm sure you're aware, and they will run with it. Like we've seen with hate crimes in Britain and America as examples, they will, even if they're not Christian, they don't follow you and they disagree with you completely, they will take that one soundbite and they will run with it, and it could cause a lot of harm.
I mean, I would kind of push back on some of the legitimacy or the fullness of that concern, but it's going to waste undue time.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But the reason I'm saying this is not something that I'm preaching or teaching.
Yep.
It's not something that I ever verbalized until I was asked.
Okay.
And I could have been a politician. I
You
could
should
have skirted around the question or carefully nuanced it. That's not my style. If somebody asks me something, I'm going to be as upfront as I can. I'm going to be as honest as I can to my understanding at that time. Okay? So here is all of the context.
Okay.
So you started off by asking me regarding the law, why is there an inconsistency? Apparently that I dress a certain way, I eat a certain diet.
I'm just telling the babysitter it might be just a little longer.
Are you alright?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Just don't want to miss it.
So firstly, the law is given to a distinct people at a distinct time, Israel.
Yep.
There are some Christians who would leave that there. And they would say everything we see in Leviticus, it is for Israel. At that period of time, it's Old Testament, we're in a new dispensation, a new era. I don't believe that that's really doing justice to what's in Leviticus. I don't believe that that is the right position to take, but that is the position that some Christians would take to one degree or another. What I would say is when we look at Leviticus, the overall message is the wages of sin is death. There are certain crimes, there are certain sins that come with capital punishment.
Yep. Can you list them for us?
Sure. I mean, by no means an extensive list, but homosexuality, premeditated murder, zoology or bestiality, like sleeping with animals, certain types of incest, kidnapping. So there's quite a kind of broad list of things, and most of them we would look at today and say that is like intrinsically evil, that is deplorable. But regardless of the crime and the sin, usually the consequence is that that person's life is taken in response to what they've done, or the life of an animal dies. There is a blood sacrifice in some shape or form. And so the general message, the overall message is that sin demands death.
Okay.
The wages of sin is death. And so when I look at Leviticus, at the very least, I see God determining for a group of people at a distinct time that he regarded homosexuality, and we don't find the language of homosexuality, that's obviously a modern construct. We see the language of sodomy, it's talking about the act of sex. That God regards that in such a way and with such gravity that he says a fitting consequence for that, a fitting penalty is death.
Does God allow, any of the people, the rapists, the gays, the murderers, to repent before they are sentenced to death, or is that's your final crime? Time to go.
I'll kind of get onto that.
Okay.
But as the law stands, as the law was given, in the same way a law would be enacted today,
Yep.
repentance is helpful. It may have some ramifications in terms of the sentence and the length of sentence or the degree of severity, but there still has to be an accounting for the crime that's been committed.
Okay.
And so as the law stood, we could look at that and say that's deplorable.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't fit in with my understanding of morality. And I can elevate my morality above God's morality as displayed in Leviticus and Exodus and those passages and Deuteronomy. But I believe that the healthy perspective would be to look at that and think, hold on, if God is speaking in such strong terms about something that I would regard as good today or harmless today, there seems to be a disconnect there. Mm-hmm. Maybe my mentality is wrong. Mm-hmm. So you have the law given to Israel. Mm-hmm. The law can be broken down into different areas of law. So you have ceremonial laws, civil laws. Mm-hmm. So those are laws that govern how Israel would address their diet, their festivities, setting aside certain days, how they manage their fields, their livestock. There was a huge list of minute laws that Israel were expected to fulfill. Yes. And the general consensus amongst Christians, and the view I hold, would be that those laws were given to Israel in order to separate them, to make them distinct from the nations around them. And every law carries a spiritual truth, that this idea of separation. So why was wearing mixed fabrics outlawed? Because it's teaching them that there is a difference between what is holy and what is unholy. There's a spiritual lesson beneath all of those things.
Just to put it in layman's terms, is that there are the big beefy laws and there are the minor laws, and they were created to...
No, so I don't believe it's a matter of big and small. So it's different categories. So you have ceremonial laws, civil laws, that govern certain areas of Israel's life. But then you have the moral law, i.e. 10 Commandments.
So those laws were created to distinguish that those are God's people in Israel, that's the aim. And then the big laws...
And ultimately to bring spiritual truth out of that, to teach Israel and us something through that.
Disciples.
To be separate from this world in every area of our lives.
Is that a good idea? To be separate rather than mingling and showing...
Well, that's how the Bible describes Christians. It says that we are...
just going off topic there.
Yeah, it says that we are in this world but not of this world.
Yeah.
And that is why this world will hate us at times, because we are no longer part of its system, its kingdom. So you have these civil laws, ceremonial laws, but then you have moral laws. So moral laws are things that largely would still be implemented in our Western society today, and would to some degree determine our legal laws as well. And you also have the penal code. You have legal laws with certain penalties also given to Israel. So Christians, at least biblical Christians, would probably universally, or certainly I would believe that those moral laws still stand. They're still binding upon us. Mm-hmm. So when the Bible says do not lie, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not take the name of the Lord in vain, do not conduct yourself sexually in certain manners, i.e. bestiality, raping people, incest, and homosexuality, that these laws are still in place morally. Now the question comes, how do those moral laws and how does the penal code that was given to Israel, how should that influence our modern legal system? Mm-hmm. And that is where we come into the topic of, should there be capital punishment for certain crimes? Should certain things be legislated against?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the questions, is obviously yourself that's preaching. Mm-hmm. I won't say we don't care what it is, but I'm not interested in that right now. I want to know your thoughts on this. So, capital punishment, yes, it should be implemented as under God's name for those sins that you list.
We're talking for all the sins, or you're talking specifically about homosexuality here?
Well, all the sins, because obviously in the Bible there is, the stoning, is a form of capital punishment, but then there is also, he who has not sinned cast the first stone. So then we go into who should even perform capital punishment. That's a very interesting topic in itself. But what I want to know, so thank you for explaining the differences. Should biblical law be in place in Britain, in your opinion?
So, as I said to you on the
God's
street, ultimately, I am not a legislator, I'm not a politician, I've got no aspiration towards that at all.
But is your...
So I believe that God, the Bible teaches that God sets kings and rulers. He sets political leaders in position for times and seasons, for judgment, for mercy. God sets those people in positions.
And do you want them to put biblical law in place?
So what I said to you on the street is I look at the law given to Moses and to Israel as being the best system that is given to mankind.
So yes.
But even within the life of Israel, we don't see that some of those severe laws are consistently carried out in the nation. We also see times of mercy as well. So I am not proposing, and I wouldn't want to see, certainly in the culture that we are in, with the variety of beliefs that we have, I wouldn't want to see the Levitical law fully imposed in our nation with every consequence that it carries. I would like to see homosexuality once again, as it was not so long ago, be legislated against.
In what way?
At least in some degree. So I would like to see laws that would prevent what we saw in Leek yesterday.
So no pride event legally.
I would like to see laws that, and again, I'm not campaigning for this.
No.
Again, I'm not preaching this. So I'm just responding to a question. You're asking me my position.
Yeah.
I would like to see laws in place that would discourage open displays of what the Bible would describe as perversion.
Could that include just, say, a gay couple holding hands in public?
Well, holding hands isn't a crime in itself. I don't think. Let's put it this way: if you were in a country, the only Christian country that has enacted laws against homosexuality, certainly capital punishment, to my knowledge, is Uganda. Don't know a lot about Uganda. I don't think the president or prime minister there has the best reputation in terms of corruption and so forth. But I believe the law there is that it's quite strong on homosexuality, so it's jail time for homosexual practice. If homosexuality takes a certain form, so it's a man forcing himself upon somebody else, if it's with a minor, then there is capital punishment in place for that.
I think that's a lack of, if it's homosexual or not, I think that's just, assaulting a minor, rape.
So the way I phrased it to you is, if I had a preference between laws that outlawed homosexuality, I'm not talking about a witch hunt, I'm not talking about raiding bedrooms, but laws that prevented public displays of homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle. Be that in pride, be it in kind of men flaunting themselves in women's clothes, be it those kinds of things where there is a desire to certainly indoctrinate the minds of the young and present this as something that is acceptable in society. I think that if a society enacted laws that prevented that, that acted as a deterrent against that, I think that society would be far better for it. And I wouldn't be entirely adverse to capital punishment playing some role in that. But what I am not saying is that I would want to see laws in place where every homosexual is rounded up and killed. No. But I'm talking about a deterrent against kind of blatant.
What sort of thing then would homosexuality would warrant capital punishment in your eyes?
Well, again, it would be up to legislators to come to that position, and that isn't me. Someone would look at that and say, well, he's just avoiding the question. He's trying to be clever so he doesn't place himself in a category. Honestly, Megan, my own inclination, I don't like the death penalty.
No, I don't.
At all.
No.
Even for murder. I believe, especially for murder, it is most biblical. I believe that nations are actually under a curse if they don't carry out capital punishment for premeditated murder, because the punishment for murder actually goes before the Levitical priesthood, before Israel. God speaks to Noah about capital punishment, that if a man sheds blood, his blood should be shed. So I think that that is most biblical. But if you're asking me how I feel just as a person, I don't want to see anybody put to death. I want to see them as live as long as possible to get right with God, to have salvation. My desire is that people would have peace with God, that there would be reformation in their life, that they would be transformed internally. So I'm not lobbying for these things, but any preference I have, any ideology I might hold to, any feeling I have, for me as a Christian, Scripture will always supersede that.
Okay.
That is my authority. So when I see things in Scripture, I'm not going to elevate my own personal feelings on a matter above that. So I believe that it's most biblical for capital punishment to be in society, certainly for premeditated murder. I believe that if a society enacted laws that outlawed homosexuality, and if part of those laws, in certain instances, was the death penalty for homosexuals, I wouldn't speak against that. I wouldn't be opposed to that, because I think that it is closer to what we see in the Bible, certainly, than where society is at today. Now, what some of your followers have done, or your circle of friends have done, they've taken that and they've said, John is saying he wants gay people dead. And that isn't what I want. At any level, that is not what I want. Or what I'm campaigning for, and what I'm preaching. I'm simply responding to a question.
Yeah, no, I know that that's not what you're going out of your way to preach. But how I personally see it is that not saying, whilst I don't want it to happen, the country will be better if it does happen, but I won't watch. So in a way that is kind of, if you think the country will be better for it happening, surely you do want it to happen.
So there are people in this nation, many of them, who don't even believe in hell.
Yeah.
And when paedophilia takes place, they will say, burn in hell, rot in hell. People would gladly see those people swinging from nooses in our streets. Not in terms of lynching them, but a lot of people in our society would welcome capital punishment for paedophiles.
Many people would. I personally don't.
When I look at that, I don't share that sentiment at all. I don't look at these people and just wish them dead. No, not at all.
No.
Whether capital punishment should be in place for that, in certain circumstances, I believe so, yes. But I would see that person hanged, or I would see that person put to death with tears in my eyes, like with great sorrow for them. And so I take no pleasure in the death, even of the most wicked of society. But I do believe, in order for justice to be enacted, for the sake of society, and for the sake of enacting just laws, I do believe that there is a place for capital punishment, even though it pains me to see that take place.
Okay.
In the same way, not in the same way, because people will run with that. I was going to say I discipline my children.
Oh, yeah.
And I take no joy in doing that, but I do it out of love for them.
Okay.
And obviously discipline is different to capital punishment, because discipline is there to hopefully reform a child, to see a child walking in the right way, not to kill them, so there is a difference there.
I am going to have to slightly speed up a bit, just because...
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I've got about 10 minutes left. We could sit for hours, I think, couldn't we? So to lighten the subject a bit, I've had a little bit of research online last night. Are you aware that there is a Marvel character who is an Aryan assassin called John Pilgrim?
Is this a legitimate question? I wasn't, and that's interesting. I'm getting this.
Yeah, I'm just saying, because obviously that's not your true name, that's your pseudonym, isn't it? So
no,
we might have to look into
there's certainly no relevance.
A new one for you.
The story behind that is I was in Pakistan 5 years, went under my own identity, Jonathan Howard, but I'd got different government agencies and people looking for me, and so I thought it kind of preferential to go with a pseudonym. And Pilgrim has a lot of religious connotation.
The pilgrimage.
So John Pilgrim.
Yeah. Which leads on to a follower's question: Is there an arrest warrant out for you in Pakistan if you went back?
There is, as far as I'm aware at this moment, yes.
Would you be able to elaborate on what that's for? Is it for preaching?
Yes, I was preaching, as was my custom, at a train station with 4 Pakistani brothers and sisters, and Hudson was with us, and we were preaching nothing overly controversial, just preaching the gospel. Actually, my female friend, she was preaching at the time, an Islamic mob came, part of a political party, brought us to the police station by force and put pressure on the authorities to press charges against us for blasphemy.
Okay.
So we came back to the UK with a view to go back, but unfortunately the lawyer who was representing me did the dirty, sold the story to the press, broke the conditions of my bail because he should have stood in for me and didn't. So as I understand it, if I went back now, I would be arrested. Yes.
Do you know what the punishment would be for your arrest?
Up to, I believe it's 3 or 5 years imprisonment. I mean, that's worst case scenario.
Yeah.
It could be
Have
far
you
less.
done any time in prison over there?
Not in prison. I've been kind of held in holding cells for like the most was like 48 hours.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Someone else asked as well is, where do you get the money, the income to preach most days of the week?
Well, preaching costs very little.
Well, yes, but obviously you have 3 children, wife at home, and I assume your children are homeschooled?
We homeschool them.
Yeah.
So
obviously your wife can't go and work if she's homeschooling.
So firstly, and I don't believe there would be any problem if I was in receipt of benefits, but to combat some of the slander and the concern, I don't have, literally we don't receive a penny of benefits.
Okay.
Not a penny. We have learned to live a very modest lifestyle in our time in Pakistan. We don't have great needs or expenses. I'm currently living with my parents, so we don't have rent to pay. We have an apartment that we let out. There's not a lot of rental yield from that. But God provides for us in a diversity of ways. When I lived in the UK, I always worked a full-time job.
Yeah.
Went to the streets in my spare time, my days off, and I would still get the accusation or go and get a job.
I mean, I got it the other day, and I mean, you're sitting in my job, you know.
Yeah.
Here you go, commenter.
It's amazing how people are concerned about whether I'm working or not as soon as I'm preaching.
But genuinely, as a concern, as a mother myself, children are expensive. So you say God provides. How do you provide the clothes, the food? I mean,
children don't have to be that expensive.
No, they don't.
We don't do designer brands. We don't
food.
generally do eating out. We cook our own food. I shop supermarket reductions. I live quite cheap. We live quite cheap.
We can spend, even with all the discounts that are possible, we can spend £150 a week on just the basics at the moment. It's insane. So I think that's where.
I mean, we manage on less than that at the moment.
Yeah.
But we don't have the overheads. We're contributing like a nominal amount. But we're not paying utility bills. We're not paying rent.
To your parents.
But if people are concerned, like if they want to donate to the charity of Chom Pilgrim and to the cause of spreading the gospel in Leek, the nation, then by all means, people. I'm not a registered charity, but people can.
But people do donate to you.
At times, Christians give money. Not talking huge amounts, but God provides. God meets our needs.
Just like your church.
And we've never made our needs public. We've never tried to raise money. We simply bring our needs to God, and it's amazing how God can lay our needs upon people's hearts, and God can stir people to at times help us with food, with money. God is good. God is faithful.
So that goes on to another one is, one of the local businesses asked, you spoke to another business who complained about lack of trade due to preaching, as we discussed, and apparently your response to her was, if you turn to God, He will feed her family. So they would like to know, can you explain to all the business owners exactly how it works and who will pay their staff?
So the Bible says that God will not allow the righteous to beg bread. God takes care of His children. And so I don't believe that if a shop was supportive of the preaching of the gospel, that God would allow them to suffer undue loss of trade, that God would take care of them. I mean, there are consequences to living as a Christian. And that may well be the loss of your business if you stand with a Christian. But I know that God will always undertake. And so if people prioritize what is righteous and true, if they prioritize the gospel, they're not going to lose out, certainly not eternally.
So, lead me on to one that I haven't got in here, but so I believe people have been told in the street, I don't know if it was by yourself or your dad, or the other preacher you come with, that their children are disabled because of their sin. You were disabled for a long time.
I was.
So God didn't provide that, and your mum and dad were very active members of the church at that time. So.
Well, I mean, God miraculously healed me in a way that wasn't consistent with any kind of medical explanation, and God sustained me during those years. So the Christian invitation isn't a guarantee that every disabled child is going to receive miraculous healing.
No. I'm just saying, so those businesses, if they were to turn to Christ, support you, it's not guaranteed then that God will
Megan,
support
I've
them.
never lacked food. I've never lacked a place to sleep. God provides for His children. But in regards to comments or alleged comments that children are born disabled because of the sins of their parents, all of us would kind of I was going to say a fancy word that I can't pronounce, but we would categorically condemn that idea. We've never taught that. We've never preached that. What we have tried to explain, and I've gone to lengths to explain the context to you before. What we will explain is the reason why there is sickness and suffering in this world is because this world is under the curse of sin. It is a product of the fall, a product of rejection of God. We are not saying at any point that because somebody sins, they are therefore ill, or because they sin, their child is ill. We have never said that. But these things continually get recycled.
Okay.
It's like racism. We continually get told, you've been racist, you've been misogynist, you've accosted people in the street or laid hands on them forcibly, all of these things. And there are things that we do preach. We preach that homosexuality is a sin. We preach that abortion is tantamount to murder. It is murder. We preach that Christ is the only way, at the exclusion of every other religion, including Islam. And these are things that are
you know, it's classed as hate speech, where, you know, if you're looking at the rules online of what hate speech are, it's saying that someone's religion is, you know, coming for someone's religion, coming for someone's sexuality, that is all hate speech. So saying that they're a sin is coming for there.
Well, no, and I can unpack that. But my point was, like, these are hills that we are happy to die on.
Okay.
But what concerns me is when I see people within the public propagating these ideas that are simply factually incorrect, because we are not racist. I have a Pakistani wife. I have mixed race children. The Christian message is one of great inclusion for every race, tongue, tribe. In no way am I racist, or are we preaching racism. We are not misogynists. We have female members of the team that preach alongside us. We are not against disabled people in any way. We could be described as homophobic, but the term needs describing and unpacking. We could be described as being intolerant to other religions. Again, that needs unpacking. These are things that we will kind of hold our hands up to. We're not trying to hide this stuff. We freely preach it.
I've got two more questions for you before I will have to go back to parenting. Do you agree with conversion therapy?
We'd have to quantify what you mean by conversion therapy.
So the Christian camps or, you know, therapies are set out to stop gay people from being gay, to convince them to be straight.
Presumably the gay people are there voluntarily.
No.
So they're forcibly taken to these camps?
By family members, not necessarily the owners of the camp. You know, there are family members who force their children to go to conversion therapy to change them. I've heard horror stories that some of the really bad ones come with chemical castration to get rid of the gay thoughts, and they pray the gay away, but not all of them. A lot of them is very much sort of just trying to stop them being gay, basically.
Well, this has become more kind of mainstream in public psyche because of legislation that is being attempted to be passed to outlaw conversion therapy. But there is already legislation in place that forbids chemical castration, or forbids forcibly taking people, or forbids violence or incitement to violence, or forbids kind of like what would be the word? When you're trying to like there's already legislation that covers those things. But and so the reason why Christians have opposed the conversion therapy laws is that it would make it illegal to simply provide counselling or prayer to somebody who's struggling with homosexual desire and seeks freedom from that.
Okay.
So I don't oppose counselling somebody who's a homosexual and they want freedom from that. Okay. I don't believe that that is the emphasis of what we should be doing. But of course the Christian message is it will speak into that area of life as well. So I don't believe that that praying for homosexual people, praying that God would give them the strength to overcome their temptation, their desires, praying that God would change their desires. I believe that that is acceptable, that is to be applauded. The stuff you talk of, chemical castration, kind of like locking people away. To my knowledge, I would question where the evidence for this even taking place is.
Yeah, no. I mean, it has happened.
And that stuff is already outlawed in our law anyway.
Doesn't stop people, does it though?
But why is there a need for new legislation if that stuff is already catered for in the current laws?
Yeah, I'm just, that many people break laws is all I'm trying to say. People still murder.
But if somebody breaks the law, you don't need a new law, you just need to enforce the law that's already there.
Okay, yeah. And then the final one, I do have more questions, but as I say, we've been here.
We can do a part 2.
We could, yes. Do you regret anything that you have said while street preaching, especially in footage?
Sure, like all the time.
Okay.
Nothing major, but there are times when I have what I've said challenged. There are times I go back and maybe listen to myself in footage and think, and I go away and I research something a bit deeper and think, okay, actually I've spoken out of turn.
Do you edit those bits out, or do you share them still?
No, I don't deliberately edit those pieces out. But for example, when I was speaking the other day and somebody said, well, Jesus was black.
Yeah.
I said he was a Jew. Jews have generally olive complexion, they're not black. Obviously that is factually incorrect. There are black Jews, they are not a majority of Jews. I don't believe Jesus was black. But what I said was inaccurate, and so I strive to be as accurate as I can in what I say. There will be times when I get stuff wrong. There will be times when I misquote stuff. There will be times when I speak in a manner that isn't becoming of the gospel. Maybe moments where I get frustrated, maybe moments when I just kind of like speak back or I speak over people, and I regret those times, so I'm constantly trying to learn. But if we're talking in terms of doctrine or saying that homosexuality is wrong before God, like those kind of things, no, I don't regret anything that I've said.
Even knowing that they could have really upset some people?
Well, the truth, like the gospel truth, will offend. It is intrinsic to the gospel, and that for somebody who believes that their lifestyle is good, for them to be told, no, it's sinful and Christ could free you from that sin, there's going to be an element of offence to that.
Yeah.
And I can't navigate around that. And I believe that God designed that to be in place.
What about other religions when they preach to you and you're offended?
Well, I don't generally take offence, Meg.
Okay.
I mean...
Well, you disagree with it, though.
Oh, that's different.
Okay.
I mean, somebody could be like totally blasphemous, totally mock my religion, tear it to pieces. I'm not going to take that personally, because their dispute isn't ultimately with me, it's with God and what God has said. And so I welcome those things. I'm not glad that somebody's saying it in that manner, but I will interact with that. I won't take offense. And one of the things, if I'm speaking one-to-one with somebody, something that I'll often say is, you can be frank with me, you will not offend me.
Okay.
I may offend you because I love you for the sake of truth, but I don't get offended on religious topics.
What I think you're saying as well is, Christianity isn't you as a whole. Christianity is, God, it's you are a Christian. But it's things like when you say, well, we'll go back to me, for example. Yes, you weren't saying I'm a bad mother, but you were saying things that I do are bad parenting and do make me a bad mother in certain ways.
In certain regards, yeah.
That's personal. It's not my entire religion. No, I'm not offended that you... Sorry. I'm not offended that you... We'll say homophobic for now, we'll unpack that another day. That you don't agree with gay people. But directly telling me about my parenting and that I'm doing wrong by my children, that does really upset me. Because as a parent, and as I'm sure you know, you try and do your best for your kids, no matter what your beliefs are. So if I came to you and I said, you're indoctrinating your children, you're doing a bad thing, I imagine you would be offended.
I wouldn't, seriously.
Okay, that's fine, but...
And the reason I said that to you, Meg, I wasn't preaching publicly and I pointed you out and said, you're a bad mother. I didn't even volunteer that. You specifically said to me, are you saying that I'm a bad mother?
Yeah.
And I said yes, and then I qualified what I meant by that. So I was responding to a question. So, of course, the implication is, do you believe that I am a good father by teaching my child that homosexuality is sinful? Do you think that is good parenting?
Because I don't know, I've not sat in a day in your life with your children. I don't agree that that's what you're teaching your children, but it is not my place to tell you if you're a bad parent. In my eyes, a good parent is... Sorry, something's clicking along over there.
It's the ghost.
Yeah, well, they're all in here. My eyes, a good parent is, you've got a healthy, fulfilled and well looked after child who will be raised into a decent human being. And I've lost my train of thought now thanks to the Tape Measure Ghost.
Would you say that I was a bad father? for
No, I
teaching my
don't.
child certain
I
ideologies, certain
remember
things.
what I was saying now, yes, is
Mhm.
no, I don't. But you did call me out a name, and I remember it, and that's why I got angry. Is yes, we had that conversation, just me and you, but when I came out and I expressed my writing, I was going to buy pencils, and you were preaching on the marketplace, and I shouted, "Don't forget, everyone, it is Pride next weekend." And you tried to talk, and I said, "I don't want to talk, Jonathan, because of our conversation last time. You called me a bad mother." When I turned around, I wasn't even interacting. I was talking to someone else. I heard you say, "Megan may think she's a good mother, but she is taking her children to hell." So that is
Well,
calling me out.
I mean, that isn't a direct quote of what I said. I said,
It's not direct quote,
I said, Megan, maybe, I'm sure she's a good mother in many ways.
Except.
Sure, and I've got no intention to hurt you.
But you did call me out.
But I care about you enough to be truthful and honest with you because I love you, I care about your soul. And so I wouldn't retract what I said. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean that I hate you. It doesn't mean that I'm setting out to offend or hurt you. I say that because I care about you. And we can live in a world where we do everything possible not to get into any area of controversy, to cause any offence one to another. But I believe that there are certain areas that really matter.
Sort of like when we were saying earlier, you discipline your children because you love them and you want to make them better.
Sure, and I'm not in a position to discipline you. You're not my child.
No, we're far closer in age than that.
But if I'm speaking to a Muslim, I'm not going to just look for all the common ground. There is elements of common ground, but I want to get to where is the conflict, because not both of these paths can be true. They could both be wrong, but they can't both be true. And so, if your understanding of good parenthood is teaching your children to be inclusive of all, that every kind of gender expression, every sexual expression when they reach a certain age is perfectly acceptable and perfectly valid. And my understanding of being a good parent is teaching them, no, there is a very strict moral code, but sex is designed to operate in a very specific environment, that you are a boy because God has made you a boy. Those two ideologies, those two ways of teaching children are very, very different. And I don't think, I would expect somebody to look at those two things and be able to come to a decision, okay, one of those is better than the other. And one of those things is better to teach a child than the other. And therefore, by implication, if a parent is teaching that in that area, they're failing because they're teaching their children something that is erroneous or something that is less than ideal.
Okay. So, just because apparently he's fallen asleep, so I'll quickly sneak in another one.
Okay.
Obviously, you're hoping that your children are, and as we already see when someone comes preaching with you, that they will go out into the world and preach the gospel. Should, Christians are persecuted for preaching, as is all religions. Should, say, Hudson, well, I won't say go to school because I homeschool, but he goes out with some friends when he's older and he sees something that he doesn't agree and he tries to preach to them, he gets beaten up.
Okay.
How are you going to feel about that? Are you going to think, good son, you're fighting the good cause, God loves you more for beating up? Or are you going to go and...
I mean, you're speaking to a man who was a boy, and my parents reminded me recently that I got a tooth knocked out on the playground for preaching the gospel.
Exactly.
So,
how would you feel if that was your son?